2025. Wow. What a very late date, in my opinion, and I'd like to congratulate you all on surviving so long in this apocalyptic cyberpunk dystopia. Post 2012, when the Mayans had predicted the end of the world, and of course, Y2K before that. And yet, we are still here, weathering the storm of technological progress that is making us all so mentally and physically ill. So now that a whole quarter of a century has gone by since the year 2000 and the 1900s are now becoming ancient history, on this momentous occasion, I'd like to take some time to do some serious and well-needed retrospection. I think it would do us all some good to mentally time travel way back into the past, to take a look at just how radically different things were those 25 plus years ago, back in the ancient steel age of the 1900s, when we were living the good life of prosperity, with the economy doing so well because the boomers had created policies that would benefit us in the short term, such as with the housing and mortgage industry, before it would all go bust and the Ponzi scheme that our capitalist system would implode down on us as it has now. So please join me here by ridding yourself of any distracting notifications that will remind you of the present as we take a little mind trip together back to the good old days before everything had been enshittified through the matrix of the modern internet and other technologies. First and foremost, let's talk about art and media. You see, back then, you wouldn't have been listening to any kind of content like this, since there either was no internet, or those that had it in the very late 1900s only had it in a very rudimentary and primitive form. There was none of the things that have pervaded our daily lives today. No YouTube videos, internet radio stations, podcasts, social media, constant ads and notifications, pornography, and all of the infinite bullshit cell phone content to get addicted to and scroll through 8 hours a day. All we had for content to consume was radio, movies, TV shows, books, newspapers, and magazines. That was literally all the content we had. It was finite and limited. For instance, TVs only had 5 stations. And guess what? Having a limited amount of content didn't actually make our lives much worse, but rather the opposite. The limited amount of it meant that what little content we did have, we paid a lot more attention to. We focused in and engaged with it. We finished what we started, unlike many of you who are already checking to see how long this video is and getting distracted by other recommendations. And because there was less content back then, more went into the making of it. And so it was often much higher quality than what you see today, and was more meaningful. So it stuck with us and made us think. And then we talked about it afterwards with our friends, and some of it helped shape the cultural narrative and even changed our lives. It was that significant. So I'd like to take a real deep dive into the types of art and entertainment content that we used to consume back in the 1900s. And I want to start with the most important and intelligent/intellectual type of content, which were called books. You see, back in those days, people didn't just watch TV for their entertainment, but they were literate. That's right, they actually read. and not just bullshit blog articles and stupid opinion pieces written for people with a third grade reading level by people with a fifth grade reading level, because most people were actually reading and writing and speaking at an adult level back then. And back then, literature wasn't just another form of mindless entertainment, but was an art that people took seriously. And it was intellectual and meaningful and thought provoking. Stories had morals and lessons that they taught us. It was commonplace for people to read whole big books, hundreds of pages long. Even when I was a child, I was reading Stephen King books as long as 700 pages, which we would read cover to cover, and then we'd often talk about them with other people who had read them because it was so common. Many of us would go through whole shelves worth of books every year, which is why many of us had whole shelves of books, libraries of them at home, and visited our public libraries often. Reading wasn't just something that was reserved for the academic elite who could actually do it. It was for everyone. I used to spend a lot of time at the library, and I wasn't even a nerd. I was actually my school's badass and was at the library often because I would get suspended from school or even expelled on 2 different years. And so I would go to the library because I would get tutored there. And then I would spend most of my afternoon there and would check out books such as the biographies of serial killers and gangsters and other badass people who I admired. And I would read true crime content or get books on how to play heavy metal guitar or the occult and the black arts and other alternative spiritual philosophies or sex books even, and everything super hardcore and cool and badass that my troubled teenage brain wanted to learn about to help me find my way in the crazy world. And without all that information to guide me, I'm 100% sure I would have ended up getting in a lot more trouble than I already was, which was already substantial as I got arrested multiple times back then. Like I said, I was expelled from school twice, 2 different years. And, if it weren't for the library giving me something to occupy and stimulate my brain and give me some positive intellectual direction, I'm sure I would have spent most of my teenage years in juvenile detention. And that's probably why a lot more children are doing that today. There's a lot more troubled youths, a lot more children who are getting involved in crime, and to think that these days most adults aren't even as literate as a troubled teen such as myself in the 90s was. And yet they are still able to vote and influence our society in spite of their complete and utter lack of literacy and knowledge. Education has gone so downhill this past generation that for the first generation, people aren't smarter than their parents, but are dumber than they have been for generations. You see, all throughout the 1900s, education was improving more and more. And so generation after generation, people were getting smarter. I'm smarter than my parents were. They were smarter than their parents were. And their parents were smarter than their parents. Right? And because of these increases in education and the collective IQ, the average IQ by the time the late 1900s were coming around was so much higher than it had been in the 1800s that the IQ level of the 1800s was considered what was now seen as a retard level, a mentally handicapped level of like 75 or something, right? So it's so interesting to look back at the 1800s and think, wow, everyone back then was pretty much mentally handicapped compared to the people of the 1900s. But now, for the first time in over 100 years, people are getting stupider and we are backsliding to the point where the average person is now starting to appear to be mentally retarded to someone who was educated during the 1900s. And why is that? It's because of the decrease in our education system. All right. People in school these days aren't being taught to read whole books anymore. Even the greatest authors of all time, such as Mark Twain, George Orwell, Mario Puzo, Ernest Hemingway, Jean-Paul Sartre, Franz Kafka, Charles Dickens, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Albert Camus, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Hermann Hesse, Oscar Wilde, Aldous Huxley, John Steinbeck, J.D. Salinger, and so many others that every adult should have read at least one book of during their education are no longer getting read, even by college students who are now only learning about classic literature by reading excerpts of a paragraph or so, or maybe a page or so. And those are just my top picks for fiction, without even getting into philosophy or other nonfiction topics that give life meaning, but which most people never touch. And people aren't being taught how to write very well anymore either. They aren't taught to write in perfect form cursive. They aren't taught to write proper English grammar and syntax, let alone good prose or whole thesis. Instead, cell phones, texting, and social media use have reprogrammed everyone's use of language to be short form and made up of minced words so that they sound like a foreigner who doesn't even speak the language, or a mentally handicapped person. And the school teachers who are funded by our tax dollars and are supposed to be using that pay to teach language skills aren't, and are just letting our kids get away with sounding retarded and letting the English language deteriorate. As many of these teachers are more focused on learning how to speak the kids' new dumbass slang languages so that they can be the cool teacher who connects with them. And of course, when I tell my kid to stop talking like that because he sounds stupid and I don't understand him, then I'm just seen as an abusive asshole by these new oversensitive woke standards. There are so many teachers and even college professors who don't teach or make their students use proper English and consider improper English to be valid if it's used by students who come from a culture where it's commonplace to speak that way, such as students of color, where the way that they talk is called ebonics, right? Because these woke teachers want to be culturally sensitive. And so there are plenty of college graduates and even college professors now who don't use proper English and can't even formulate a proper English sentence. For instance, I was actually almost interviewed by one person who had gotten a PhD. It was like from an online university like the University of Phoenix, but it was still a recognized PhD. And they had a website and a podcast where they taught things. And they wanted to have me on to teach about my area of expertise, until I saw the title and description she had written for the show that we were planning, which looked like it had been written by a second grader. And so I canceled the show and told her exactly why, and she did not like it. And her response was like, "Oh, I'm a PhD, I'm an academic, and you aren't, so how dare you correct my use of language?" It's like, well, I may not be a PhD from the University of Online wherever, but at least I know how to write proper English sentences. And this is a common thing. Even my son's mother, who wasn't that good with language, and I would often be correcting her on using words wrong, mispronouncing them, etc., once dropped a college class because the professor, who was a black man, spoke in terrible ebonics. And she's like, how could I learn from someone who doesn't even speak proper English, who I speak proper English more than? And I'm like, yeah, and you don't even speak it, as properly as me, who doesn't even go to college. These are the types of people who are teaching students and they aren't being held to any kind of standards of proper English. So no wonder everyone is so illiterate and retarded and can't answer basic questions that I used to be able to answer even in elementary school. Because they can't even write a proper sentence. They can't even formulate the proper English wording to be able to communicate intelligently. And many schools have actually turned into liberal, leftist, feminist, Marxist indoctrination camps that aren't teaching facts, but woke matriarchal ideologies, such as all the LGBT nonsense, feminizing our boys and masculinizing our girls. Treating boys as though they're broken women and women as though they're broken men. And so it's as if the modern education system is dumbing people down instead of raising their intelligence. And I know some of you are out there saying, well, hey, I don't read books either. That's nerdy. And I'm not stupid. I know how to read. I just only read cool stuff that I find online that interests me and is entertaining. And you know what? If you think books are for nerds and you do not read them, you are actually functionally illiterate and stupid in that sense. All right? Because, as I said, most online articles these days are written at a third or even second grade level. And you may actually have been retarding and rotting your brain inside of your skull by focusing only on entertaining little blog articles and whatever. And if you do not read books, then you probably cannot read books. Like, how do you know you can do it if you aren't? You probably can't, right? And books are what it takes for you to get smarter. All right. So I highly recommend you get yourself some books to read before you start to suffer from early onset Alzheimer's. Because the lack of proper education and literacy is causing IQs to drop to the lowest they've been in over 100 years. But the most interesting thing about the retard level IQ back in the 1800s was that back then, while people were generally illiterate and most people who were not highly educated could not read and write, they at least spoke very proper English. They were at least taught to speak a much more proper form of the English language than most people speak today, in spite of those people today having gone through at least elementary school. But back in the 1800s, a lot of people would drop out of school to help their parents work on their farm or go work in a sweatshop. So they would only get educated for a few years in school and wouldn't even learn to read or write, but yet they were taught by their parents the oral tradition of proper English that isn't even getting taught today. And so after 100 years of increases in education and IQ and literacy, we're actually backsliding almost to a point before the 1800s, where people are, in that sense, more retarded than they were in the 1800s. All right. So it is very, very alarming. And especially if you look forward, if we continue on this trajectory, everyone will soon be extremely mentally handicapped, except for the few of us nerds like me who still read a lot and enjoy educational activities and learning new things. And if you are one of the few rare intelligent people out there who do like to read books, or you would like to try to read more books so that you can increase your intelligence level, and you are looking for some interesting, intellectually stimulating and entertaining books to read, I've actually linked several of the books that I have written in the description of this video down below, so you can check those out. I've got a true crime book called The Italian-American Mafia, A Socio-Political Perspective. That is my last book that I wrote and is one that I'm proudest of. And I've also got a Mafia novella that is like a movie in book format for those who want some really highly stimulating and entertaining storylines to read. And I have books on social science and relationships, a book on misandry, exposing the anti-male sexism of today. I've got books of surreal psychedelic poetry that I've written based on my studies of spiritual philosophy and my practices of shamanism and psychedelic drug use. There's all sorts of interesting intellectual content there for you that you'll find very stimulating and cerebral. So be sure to check that out. It's all available on Amazon, and it all costs like between 10, 15, 20 bucks. So get yourself some good books that will actually make you think and help to give your life some meaning, which is so important for us humans. And if you would like me to put out a video on books and building your own library and the types of authors and, classic and important books and literature that I would highly recommend everyone get for themselves, let me know in the comments below. If I receive multiple comments suggesting it, I will do that. And you can also check out my artist channel called the Scallywag Artist Channel, linked below, where I put out spoken word poetry readings, short literature, as well as music and other artwork too. Because this illiteracy issue is only part of the problem that we are facing today. Another part of the problem is the extremely dumbed down entertainment and brain rot content that is being substituted for the good and meaningful intellectual art that we used to entertain ourselves with back in the 1900s, such as the music and movies we used to enjoy, which were much more artistic and meaningful than those today. And that is what I'm going to get into next in the next video on this series, looking back at the 1900s. So make sure that your subscription is set to all so that you're notified when that's released. Or you can also check the video description below, where I will be linking it once I have put it out, and I will talk to you guys there.